Welcome back to Digital Christianity, Episode 9. Are we all a bunch of addicts and drunkards? Throughout this episode, you will hear us reference Anna Lembke's book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Lembke is the medical director of Stanford Addiction Medicine, program director for the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship, and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She is the recipient of numerous awards for outstanding research in mental illness, for excellence in teaching, and for clinical innovation and treatment. If you watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, you might recognize her as one of the experts who makes an appearance. While we recommend her book in this episode, as you'll hear, we also offer a caution due to some of the sexual addictions she discusses in the book. That said, it's an important book because she discusses something that's possibly the defining characteristic of our culture: dopamine. Listen to her introduction from the book. This book is about pleasure. It's also about pain. Most important, it's about the relationship between pleasure and pain, and how understanding that relationship has become essential for a life well lived. We've transformed the world from a place of scarcity to a place of overwhelming abundance. Drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, texting, sexting, Facebooking, Instagramming, YouTubing, tweeting. The increased numbers, variety, and potency of highly rewarding stimuli today is staggering. The smartphone is the modern-day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. If you haven't met your drug of choice yet, it's coming soon to a website near you. Let me introduce you to Patrick Miller.
I'm Patrick Miller, and I'm a pastor in Columbia, Missouri at The Crossing. I'm the co-author of Joyful Outsiders and the podcast host of Truth Over Tribe.
In addition to being a pastor, author, podcaster, he serves as the director of digital relationships at his church. I was curious what that entailed.
You know, it's meant to confuse. That's the primary goal. No. You know, I've had to walk a tightrope in my career because on the one hand, I think that there are good and proper uses of technology inside the church. And if you look throughout Christian history, you'll discover that in many cases, Christians are actually on the forefront of using technology to spread the gospel. We still don't know why the early Christians were the first people to begin organizing books into scrolls into codices. Previous to Christianity, everybody kept everything on scrolls, and it was the Christians who really said, no, we need to have books, probably because it's easier to find things in books than it is in scrolls. But that changed the structure of how people thought and engaged with text. Or you can move forward to the printing press. And there is no Reformation without the printing press. Martin Luther was far from the first person to make some of the key insights that defined the Reformation. But what was different was that he had a printing press and was able to distribute his texts widely. Again, if you go to the generation of radio, Christians were some of the first people to utilize radio to spread the gospel. And so I think when we look at technology, we have to look at opportunities and costs. And we really firmly believe at our church that there are good uses of technology. Podcasting, which we're doing right now, is a fantastic example. As more and more people are, less and less used to being in the church, every day of the week or being in, classes, it's a great way to do Christian education, for example. And so there can be really positive uses of digital technology. And that's one of the things, it's not the only thing I do, but it's one of the things I do as a pastor is making sure that we're resourcing our church digitally with blog posts, email newsletters, podcasts, those sorts of things. And yet, precisely because I live very much in this digital world and I'm positive about it, I'm also very conscious and aware of the ways that digital technology can deform our souls. And so I always laugh. If I'm in a room full of Luddites who are critical of technology, I'm always the most pro-technology person in the room. And if I'm in a room full of people who think everything technology does is great, we should embrace technology in all instances, I'm the most apocalyptic. I'll be the one who says, no, you guys really don't understand how deforming this stuff really can be.
Anytime Christians talk about our concerns with technology, we always have to pull back and talk about the good. Throughout this podcast, we've done that. In many ways, I felt like this aspect of Patrick's job as the director of digital relationships epitomizes the mindset Christians should seek to have towards technology. What can we receive and what can we reject in relation to technology? Several episodes ago, we spoke about Neil Postman. If you remember, there's a forthcoming book through Crossway and the Gospel Coalition based off of Postman's work entitled Scrolling Ourselves to Death. You can find more information in the show notes. Over the next 3 episodes, you'll hear from contributors to this book. The chapter Patrick contributes to deals with the topic of addiction. I began asking him about Postman and how his work paved the way for this conversation on addiction.
Well, far be it from me to pretend to be a Neil Postman scholar. However, I have read Postman widely, and in the run-up to writing the chapter for Scrolling Ourselves to Death, I actually on my own website went through a chapter-by-chapter reading where I was responding to every chapter he wrote and applying it to our modern moment. While Neil Postman was prescient about what would happen in the future, he was fixated on how television in particular was impacting the mind and the thinking of American people. He had no way of knowing that we would have little television screens in our pockets that connected us to algorithmic slot machines that are designed to addict us. And yet, his insights are still incredibly applicable. Postman actually said in his book that every era in American history could be represented by a city. He said that Boston was the apotheosis of the Revolutionary War. Chicago was the incarnation of industrial dynamism. That New York was the personification of melting pot America. And then he argued that Las Vegas was the avatar of an over-entertained America. And I think he's right, but I would actually go one step further. Las Vegas is also the avatar of addicted America. If you know anything about gambling, you'll know that it is actually a highly, highly addictive behavior. Not because you're shooting something into your veins that has an addictive substance, but because the human mind is quite literally wired to produce dopamine whenever we receive variable rewards. So a slot machine, the joy that comes from a slot machine, by the way, is not from winning. It's from pulling the lever and feeling like you might win and getting different results every time. A loss, a small win, a big win. That's the fun. And that's what actually gets people addicted to slot machines. A Stanford professor named Anna Lembke has written about this extensively in her book, Dopamine Nation, which I would recommend anyone read. I will give a warning. There's some pretty explicit content in it because she talks about sexual addictions as well. However, I think for that very reason, Las Vegas is a picture of our current digital era because our digital technology is designed to create addiction. And whether or not you think you're addicted, you are. If you feel, a phantom vibrations in your pocket, you're addicted. If you find yourself without even thinking, pulling out your phone and almost by intuition clicking buttons just to see what comes up next on your social media, you're addicted. If you've ever had a night where you get onto Instagram or YouTube and you're scrolling through shorts and all of a sudden 30 minutes pass and you think, how in the world did I just spend 30 minutes watching pointless videos? Well, that was the joy of the slot machine. Who knows what's going to come up next? Who knows what fun thing I'll see, what joy I'll get, or maybe it'll be bad, but that's the variable reward. That's the slot machine that we're all pulling on. And so I think Las Vegas is an amazing picture, not just because of its entertainment, but because of the gambling of the current era that we're living in.
I don't know if you feel this way, but sometimes I get the sense that we're all becoming numb to words like addiction when they're in the context of smartphones and social media. We can hear this so much, it just becomes white noise in the background. However, there's an important nuance Patrick points to as he's discussing his involvement as a contributor to this book.
Yeah, so I've been writing about technology for the Gospel Coalition, which helped produce this book alongside Crossway for several years now. And everybody there knows that I do walk this weird tightrope. So several years ago, I did a good faith debate with my friend Jay Kim, where he argued for less technology in church, and I actually argued for more technology. Now, we both laughed because he's not a Luddite, and I'm not for all technology in churches. But I think as a result of writing on these topics and showing what I hope is some level of nuance on the topic, I'm not against technology, but I'm certainly not oblivious to the risks. They wanted me to come in. And so each person was essentially responding to a different chapter or section or idea in Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And as I was thinking about my chapter and what I wanted to respond to, this idea of addiction really came into the foreground. And the reason why is I think everybody understands, the problems that come with social media surveilling us and collecting our data and selling our data. We all know about how that can affect elections and affect our economy, right? That's all stuff people are aware of. But I don't think that goes far enough. When we want to describe the media that we're intaking every day, we need a word for it. And I think the best word for it is dopamine media, because it's media that's quite literally designed to release dopamine in the brain, which is precisely why it is so addictive. If you don't get to the addictive root of our social media, you won't be able to deal with the problems that it creates in your life.
Technology always involves trade-offs, says Postman. Listen to Patrick again.
Yeah, all technology, especially communication technology, comes with trade-offs. In a different book that Postman wrote called Technopoly, he reflects on a myth from Plato's book Phaedrus, which I'm sure everybody here has read. I haven't actually read it, so but I'm taking Postman at his word here. In that story, there's an Egyptian king named Thamos, and he's talking to the divine progenitor of reading and writing. And this guy's name is Thus. You've got Thamos, is a little bit confusing. Thamos the king, and Thuth, the guy who invents writing. And the god explains all the benefits that will accrue to humans if they adopt this new media format, if they start reading and writing. Because at the time in the story in Egypt, it was an oral culture. There wasn't reading, there wasn't writing. And here's what happens. The king of Egypt, he doesn't believe him. He doesn't buy in. He says the trade-off isn't worth it. And this is what Postman writes. He says, those who acquire writing will cease to exercise their memory and become forgetful. They will rely on writing to bring things to their remembrance by external signs instead of by their own internal resources. Now, he is undeniably correct. People who live in oral cultures, has been proven, have far superior memory to those who live in literate cultures where people have to read and write. So there was a trade-off. Now, I think the trade-off is ultimately worth it. At the end of the day, the ability to record information, to have long-form discourse, and to have the kind of thinking that's produced by writing, which is discursive in its nature, that's a good trade-off. It's not that oral cultures are bad. It's just I do think having literacy is a good thing. But there's a trade-off. Now, the question then becomes, when we're going from being a literate culture to being a dopamine media culture, what are the trade-offs that we make in that instance? What happens when we go from a world where, let's take Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It had a wider readership in terms of America's population than the Super Bowl did. Now, you go and you read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, you will think this is a hard book. This is a really challenging book. And proportionally, more Americans read it than watched the Super Bowl. So what are the trade-offs that come from being a highly literate, book-based, text-based culture to becoming a culture that is largely image-based, that is largely consuming media, in our case, in very short visual formats? Well, it's going to change how you think. It's going to change how you retain information. It's going to change how you see yourself and how you see the world. And is the trade-off worth it?
Statistics show that we, especially teenagers, spend most of our waking hours on screens without a lot of direction on managing our online life. In the devotional, Social Media Pressure, Finding Peace Alongside Jesus, it will help you see why social media can leave you feeling sad, anxious, and depressed, and points to practical ways of turning to Jesus for rest and wholeness. The 16-day devotional will guide you in making sure that your relationship with God remains at the center of your life without letting your phone take over. This devotional addresses common issues associated with social media, including pressures like the fear of missing out, comparing yourself with others, being bullied, and even being addicted. Each entry will help you interact with social media in a way that is sensible, smart, and even biblical, while at the same time finding the peace that comes with walking alongside Jesus. You You can pick up your copy of this devotional today at Amazon or visit New Growth Press to get a discount rate for bulk orders of groups to work through this devotional together. More information in the show notes. Addiction, broadly defined, says Lembke, is the continued and compulsive consumption of a substance or behavior like gambling, gaming, sex, despite its harm to self and or others. In many ways, the word addiction is thrown around because there's a sense in which we can become addicted to anything. Along these lines, Lembke speaks openly about her addiction to erotic novels. It began with something milder like the popular vampire series Twilight, but progressed from there. Listen as she shares. In short, I became a chain reader of formulaic, erotic genre novels. As soon as I finished one ebook, I moved on to the next. Reading instead of socializing, reading instead of cooking, reading instead of sleeping, reading instead of paying attention to my husband and my kids. Once, I'm ashamed to admit, I brought my Kindle to work and read between patients. I looked for ever cheaper options all the way down to free. Amazon, like any good drug dealer, knows the value of a free sample. About a year into my new obsession with romance, I found myself up at 2 a.m. on a weeknight reading 50 Shades of Grey. What happened to me is trivial compared to the lives of those with overpowering addiction, but it speaks to the growing problem of compulsive overconsumption that we all face today, even when our lives are good. I have a kind and loving husband, great kids, meaningful work, freedom, autonomy, and relative wealth, no trauma, social dislocation, poverty, unemployment, or other risk factors for addiction. Yet, I was compulsively retreating further and further into a fantasy world. Listen to Patrick discussing dopamine as well as something called intermittent variable reward.
Yeah. So let's start with how dopamine works in the brain. And let's just remember, I'm not a neurologist, but I have read some. According to Dr. Anna Lembke, a neurologist at Stanford University, our brains can be imagined something like a seesaw. And when you experience something good, something positive, it pushes on one side of the seesaw. And the way the brain does that is by releasing a chemical called dopamine. So when you eat chocolate, your brain releases dopamine. This makes sense, right? Not just that sweets are good, but up until recently, they were rare and they were valuable, right? Getting more sugar was good for your metabolism. And so your brain's saying, oh, this is good. Get me more of that. Sex releases dopamine. Again, it's good to procreate. This is a positive thing for the human species. It makes sense why we feel that way. But we also have dopamine released when we have positive feelings in our community, when we're cared for. These are all things that press on the dopamine side of our brain. What people don't realize is that the brain desires equilibrium. In other words, it doesn't want to be in a constant state of happiness or, on the other side, a constant state of depression and anxiety. And so the way the brain reacts to any push on either side is to give you the opposite. So if you press on your dopamine side, your brain will actively try to bring you into equilibrium by dosing you with some level of pain. That might be in the form of anxiety. It might be in the form of sadness. And we all experience this, right? You have an amazing party and you eat birthday cake and you're there with your friends and they're celebrating you. And then the party is done and you're like, oh man, I kind of feel a little bit empty. Well, that's a good thing, right? Life is not full of only highs. That's your brain equalizing. And the opposite is true. If you're going through a lot of anxiety or sadness, your brain will release more dopamine to try to bring you back into a state of equilibrium so that you're not stuck in the darkness. The problem is that we now live in a culture, in a moment where all the things that produce dopamine are easily accessible to us. Food, sugar. And then, of course, there are substances like cigarettes and drugs and heroin that actively produce dopamine inside of our brain. And again, brain scientists can look at this. They can figure out how much different things release dopamine inside of our minds. When you start pressing that hard on the dopamine side all the time, whether that's with entertainment or with substances or with food, you are slowly making yourself immune to dopamine. You have to get more to get the same hit. So for example, the first time you watch TikTok, it might be delightful. I watched 2 videos. This was amazing. I want to go back to get more because you're designed to get dopamine. Well, next time it's going to have to be 4 videos, and then it's going to have to be 10 videos, and then it's going to have to be 100 videos before you can get that same hit. And every single time your brain's pushing on the opposite side. Now, what do? When your brain's pushing on the anxiety, pain side, you want more dopamine. So what do? You go back to the thing that is giving you dopamine. This is how addiction loops get created. We feel sad, we feel empty, so we go to the thing that gives me happiness, that gives me this chemical in my brain. And what, again, we don't realize is these little devices that we hold in our pockets, they're digital syringes. Research shows time and again, they have an incredible power to release dopamine. And again, the way that they do this is by offering intermittent variable rewards. This means that every time you get onto an app, you don't know what you're going to get. The beauty of Instagram is not that you're following your friends. It's that if I start looking through reels or videos, I don't know what that video will be. Maybe it's going to be a cute puppy and it's going to make me laugh. Or maybe it's going to be an emotional video that makes me cry. Or maybe it's just going to be an interesting video. You see how it's variable. You don't know what you're getting, but it's also intermittent. Not every video is the same. Some are going to be boring, others aren't. And so you're scrolling through. And so it's the promise of getting the reward, the video that gives you the dopamine hit that keeps you coming back. On the other side, you experience it when you post things. Am I going to come on? Am I going to have lots of likes? Am I going to have lots of comments? Well, again, those rewards are intermittent. You don't get them all the time, and they're variable. Some posts go viral, and oh my gosh, all my friends are reading this, and doesn't that feel amazing? Other times, there's nothing. And that's why you might find yourself, if you're posting things, constantly refreshing. Oh, have I got a new like? Have I got a new comment? Because your brain was designed to do this. And so these entire systems, they were designed literally by behavioral psychologists. These tech companies hire behavioral psychologists. These are the smartest behavioral psychologists in the world. They are paid so much money to design these apps to addict your brain to what they're doing. And that's why many of these psychologists are now coming out and blowing the whistle and saying, hey, this is what we did and we shouldn't have done it. And if they aren't blowing the whistle, you know what they all have in common? They don't give these phones to their children. Because I wouldn't give my kid heroin. I wouldn't give my kid a cigarette. Why would I give them something just as deadly, a device?
In his chapter, Patrick says this: Amuse doesn't quite describe the effect dopamine media has on us. Dopamine media is designed to distract us to death. Or, if we're more honest, to distract us into an addiction that leads to death. Research shows that the more available and normalized a drug is, the more pervasive addiction to that drug becomes. So it's no surprise the vast majority of American adults are walking around shooting up digital dope without raising an eyebrow. The best of us are responsible users who can consume media in moderation. But none of us is fully sober. Throughout this series, we're constantly calling our listeners to do a lot of self-examination and reflection in this area of our lives. But RYM's mission is to reach and equip youth for Christ. So we want you thinking about the lives of your children and students. Along these lines, I asked Patrick about the impact of addiction on children's brains.
Yeah. First of all, we need more research on this. One of the problems we run into is that new technology is new. And so you don't know what the consequences are until you have a generation or two that use the technology, which then can be compared to previous generations. And so we're still early enough in this technology to not be entirely sure what it's doing. What we can say is this: Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Anxious Generation, shows, I think, scientifically, empirically, that there is no doubt that the heightened rates of anxiety and depression, of eating disorders and image-based issues inside of children is directly correlated and caused by screen technology. And it needs to be said that he's cautious. When he wrote his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, back in, I think, 2017, he noted this correlation. He said, hey, there's something about using devices and anxiety and all these mental health issues that seem to be related. But in that book, he said, we can't prove causation. So we shouldn't go so far as to say the phones are causing it. Well, then 6 years later, he publishes The Anxious Generation. He says, okay, well, now the research is in and we don't need to be cautious. This is causing mental health disorders in our children Full stop. His recommendation is that you do not give devices to a child before the age of 16. Smartphones, anything that has access to the internet or social media. You could give, for example, a dumb phone or an Apple Watch or something that didn't have access to some of this technology with, it seems to be, lower consequences, because it's social media in particular that's causing many of these issues. Children see their friends having fun outside of their environment. They think, oh my gosh, I'm being left out. They see people who have perfect bodies and perfect lives, and they're not at a place where they're discerning enough to realize, okay, that's not real. And so they feel bad about themselves. They feel depressed. They feel anxious about missing out. This is to say nothing about online bullying and the terrible things that are said and communicated and shared online. The reasons to keep your child off of these devices are immense. You can go one step further and talk about the amount of predatory stuff that happens online. Children who are contacted by or used by those who are sexual predators. I just keep going, and it would get disturbing. You can read about it. There's fantastic articles about all of this. The reality is that there is no research that shows that giving your kid these devices improves their life. Now, I know the pushback is always, well, but my kid's going to be left out. And I think there's good responses to that. I can't count the amount of times I'm out driving around and I see a group of kids, sitting outside. And I think to myself, if that was me when I was 15 out with my friends, we'd have sticks and be sword fighting or doing some sort of shenanigans. But we'd be talking to each other. We'd be engaging with each other. And it's so shocking and striking to see these teenagers sitting next to each other, staring at their phones. That's what it means to be alone together. It's incredibly isolating. Even if your kid has a social life, it is incredibly isolating to be on a device, because that's where communication happens. That's why they want to be there. But let's press further than that. My teenage years were where I developed the social skills I needed to engage with other people, to have the courage to walk up to someone I didn't know and introduce myself and say hi and have a conversation, to have small talk. And these skills are disappearing. And as they disappear, again, it makes us more isolated because we don't have community. And I think this is also true of adults. How often do you see adults who are spending time with each other and there's an awkward silence? And rather than living in the awkwardness for a moment, people start pulling out their phones. They start scrolling on the internet. And again, it creates a feeling of isolation. You experience this in your marriage. When you're spending time together, you're on a date, and then all of a sudden your spouse pulls out their phone and they're spending 3 minutes, 5 minutes on social media. And you're like, how did we get here that we're going on a date, we're not talking, and we're both just sitting here looking at our phones? It's incredibly isolating. You already mentioned the other element, which is that it is most certainly changing our attention span. And there's, again, tons of research to show this, and people might not care, like, oh, well, why does it matter if my attention span dropped from 45 seconds to 9 seconds? Well, why it matters is because God gave us minds, and our minds are designed to be able to think logical thoughts, to be able to reason things out, to be able to have discourse on subjects, to learn from one another. If your only way of intaking information is image-based, you will become a highly subjective, highly influenceable person. You won't know how to use your brain. If we don't read anymore and we don't know how to have long-form discourse, to be nuanced in our thoughts, we're going to be people who are unnuanced, who have uncareful takes on important issues. And so, again, this applies to teens. It applies to adults. There's so much research that shows that these devices are having a detrimental effect on our life on the whole.
As I closed my time out with Patrick, I asked him about his relationship to a smartphone. He gives some helpful thoughts and practical advice for all of us.
Yeah, that's really challenging. Again, I'm not speaking someone who doesn't struggle with these things. As a parent, I've had my kids multiple times make comments like, oh, why are you on your phone right now? I mean, just the other day, my daughter wanted me to look at something, and to be totally candid, it was not the most interesting or engaging thing. She was rolling a ring or something, and she was like, look at this. And I was looking at something on my phone already, and she doesn't. She's like, wait, are you looking at your phone? I thought, okay, at the end of the day, her rolling a ring across the floor is not the most important thing in the world, but she is really important. She's far more important to me than whatever it was. I don't even remember what I was looking at. I do remember her rolling the ring, though. She is far more important to me. And so I think on a practical level, what this looks like is creating rules and structures inside of your life to resist the technology that you have. And that can go in a number of formats. For example, I think everybody should limit their social media intake and platforms. I'm on Twitter So that's one that I use, but I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on Facebook. I don't use every social media platform. So that really limits the amount of distraction. I don't have 3 different places I can go for my little variable rewards. I've got one that I can go to, right? So one slot machine better than 3. That's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is to turn off notifications. I don't have any notifications on any of my social media. So, I'm not getting buzzes and alerts every time someone else posts or every time someone likes something that I post. And again, that just keeps me from getting distracted. Another element, and this is what I do throughout my day, my phone is on Do Not Disturb for the entire day. Now, I have, my wife has access so she can call through it. But this keeps me from getting distracted by text messages, from any media, email, all of that, because I just don't get notifications. I check it when I check it. And I would encourage anybody who has a phone to do that. I think another key component is where your phone sleeps. I don't have my phone in my room when I go to sleep. I read books before I go to sleep. My phone's not going to be in there. And the same thing goes to, what do you wake to? Are you waking to God? Are you waking to something that energizes to you? Or is your first step opening up your phone, checking your email, checking your social media, and then moving on to God? Well, if you're anything like me, by the time I've done that, I have unleashed so much anxiety in my life and distraction into my life that I can't even engage with what I'm reading in God's word. So that's a huge practice you can embrace. And then I think the last thing is just saying, on weekends, at other times, leaving your phone in other rooms, especially when you're with family or with friends, is an incredible strategy for limiting its distraction. It's also the very place where you'll start realizing how addicted you are. If you put your phone into a different room while you have guests over at your house, which I would encourage everyone to do, you will find I'm in a conversation, there's a weird moment, and now I'm reaching for my pocket. Like, I want to pull out my syringe and take a quick hit, right? You'll start becoming aware of that. And so these are all strategies that I try to use to limit it. Now, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, I'm personally free of these devices. The ultimate solution is get yourself a dumb phone, get off of social media and say, I'm done with it. And I think, frankly, for some people, that's the best decision. Some of us have ministry callings online that we need to pursue. Others of us have vocational callings that require us to be online that we need to pursue. But I think for a lot of people, there might just be a time to say, look, I actually don't need any of this, so I'm not going to have it on my phone. I'm not going to have an account. I'm going to live my life free of social media. And if that's you, praise God.
You've been listening to Digital Christianity by Reformed Youth Ministries. For more information about our summer conferences, youth leader training, and resources, visit rym.org. If you would take the time to leave a positive review and share this podcast with others, it's one small way to help our ministry. Stay tuned to the RYM podcast for more great content that seeks to serve the church in her efforts to reach and equip youth for Christ.